Hello, I'm Juliet Foster and welcome to the European Magazine webinar. Today I'm joined by Michael Lohan. Michael is the CEO of IDA Ireland, which is the body responsible for bringing foreign direct investment into the country. So Michael, it's an absolute pleasure to see you. Let's kick off with Ireland's reputation because it is renowned for having a stable and predictable tax environment that's brought in multinational companies over the years. But are you concerned perhaps that the Apple tax case could potentially put that at risk, given that it took a very long time to resolve itself?
Thanks, Juliet. Delighted to be part of this afternoon's conversation. So in short, my answer would be no, I don't believe it's going to change Ireland's reputation. And the reason for that is maybe twofold. Firstly, is we're speaking of an event in terms of the Apple case, which was determined under state aid, which is actually historical in nature. And secondly, we've seen a significant change in terms of global taxation with the OECD BEPS process, and Ireland is a contributor and signed up to the OECD BEPS process. And actually, we fundamentally agree with having clarity and certainty in terms of our taxation policy on a global scale. So, and I think also what from my engagement with business leaders and global leaders, taxation is one point that's actually discussed, but you have to have a suite of pro-enterprise policies. You have to have a suite of activity to support, I suppose, innovation and talent. So tax is just one element of that decision, or indeed what in terms of first off investment or indeed continued investment. But in Ireland, we, I suppose, very much pride ourselves on having clarity in terms of our policy and certainty in terms of that direction. And that's what we'll continue to do from an Ireland perspective.
But from what you're saying, it does appear as if the tax case, if anything, it's basically enhanced that reputation. So effectively, it could actually open the doors for more multinationals to come in because, as you've said, there is now real, genuine clarity.
Well, certainly there is clarity, and I think under the OECD BEPS process, we welcome that clarity. I think what has to happen as well as we look forward in global taxation to the future is we have to make sure that the principles of the OECD BEPS actually are maintained. So I think the risk could be is that different nations decide to maybe move away from the current principles of OECD BEPS, and I think we maybe potentially might be starting to see some elements of that at an international level, but we would be very much of the view that bringing that stability and certainty for global companies in global taxation is fair, and I think it's the right thing to do both from an enterprise perspective and indeed a societal perspective.
And the conversation is happening at a time when Ireland itself has just had its latest budget. I want to look at specific measures within that package, which you believe could support continued foreign direct investment. What were they? What are the standout things which, again, are going to attract multinationals in that budget?
So our budget, we're in a fortunate position that we had a strong budget surplus, and I suppose that's based on the fact that the fundamentals of our economy are very strong in terms of not just the financial return, but also the demographics and indeed the growth sectors that we have from an enterprise perspective. But within the budget, we saw a 3 million top up been given to key infrastructure elements, which will support, yes, enterprise and foreign direct investment, but also I think will have an impact on the broader society. And those areas were across water, across energy, across housing. So critically important that Ireland is on a course. We have increased our population by 10% in the last decade. So we're a growing economy. And as a growing economy, we have to make sure we have the infrastructure to match. And the budget, just in the last recent weeks, has actually allocated additional funding, as I said, 3 billion towards that. Critically important. And also within the budget, there was a number of changes and amendments, very much on the entrepreneurial side and for SMEs, again, to make sure we foster innovation. Because in every economy, you need to have an Indigenous and, I suppose, a homegrown innovation as well as foreign direct investment.
I mean, look, there's a good news story that is coming out of Ireland economically, but at the same time, it's happening against a backdrop of extraordinary geopolitical turbulence. So can Ireland insulate itself sufficiently against those forces, given what is happening, so that it doesn't undermine the drift of money into the Irish economy from overseas?
Yeah, so Ireland is a very open economy, and we've benefited from being an open economy looking to the globe. For our first, I suppose, part of our development, we were inward looking. And it's only when Ireland's economy started to look out to the world and look out to the opportunity that was as an open economy that our economy has flourished. So within that environment, we have to, there's elements that we can control. And the elements that we can control is our ability to stay nimble, to stay agile, to align ourselves to growth areas in global economies. And we believe those growth areas and have proven to be across life sciences, in healthcare, in pharmaceuticals, in medical devices, in technology, whether you're in technology of semiconductors or in the large platforms, is so important, in international financial services and high value manufacturing. So these are the key areas where we actually believe we can bring a differentiator to the global economy and indeed to companies who choose Ireland either for the first time or indeed have established presence in Ireland. So as the economy continues to, I suppose, and the geopolitical, I suppose, environment continues to change, we have to make sure in Ireland, as an open economy, we stay nimble and we stay focused on those areas where we can bring value.
I mean, that they are important aspirations, but at the same time, just to play the devil's advocate, there are other economies that have similar goals too. So given that, how can you retain or grow your competitiveness in the world that's changing and at the same time make sure that you bring more FDI into the economy?
Yeah, and it's a valid point. The competition for FDI has never been as intense as it is now at this moment, and possibly for the last 12 to 18 months. We know internationally that FDI flows, the total number of FDI flows internationally is actually decreasing. But yes, within that overall pool that's decreasing, the scale of investments is actually increasing. So interesting, we're seeing larger scale investments happening from a smaller pool. And what does this mean for Ireland? It means a few things. First of all, as I mentioned, aligning yourselves to those areas of growth in global economies is so important, and those sectors of growth. Secondly, deepening and strengthening your capability from an innovation perspective. Thirdly, making sure you have the right skill set and availability to do it. And fourthly, an ecosystem, a supportive ecosystem. And Ireland has all of those four elements in terms of the capability, the capacity, the competitiveness to deliver. And we've proven that. So actually, while some nations are striving to get there, in Ireland, we've already proven that. We have 1,800 client companies here in the FDI portfolio and IDS portfolio in Ireland, employing over 300,000 people. But the productivity that comes from that is actually what sets us apart. And if we take maybe one stat in that and how that's evolved over the last decade, for example, the R&D expenditure in FDI has increased by over 500% in the last decade. So we're seeing how we're actually at the very forefront of innovation, of next value products and services. And for Ireland, like as I said, we're proven we can be there. What we have to do is make sure that we stay within those areas of continued growth. And with the policies that we have from a pro-enterprise perspective, with the skill base that we have and the ecosystem, I firmly believe that's where we're going to continue to prosper.
Okay, let's drill this down a little bit further by focusing on the United States, because yes, the presidential elections are a handful of days away, and one of the talking points, certainly in the Trump campaign, has been the imposition of tariffs. My question to you is, how do you think tariffs could impact Ireland's global open economy? And at the same time, Ireland is a member of the European Union, so you can argue, plausibly, that if tariffs are imposed, it's going to affect the EU and it's also going to affect you.
Yeah, so in terms of tariffs, and obviously there's a lot of conversation and narrative around tariffs, at this juncture. And if tariffs are imposed, obviously they're not imposed on a country by country basis. They will be on a pan-European basis, or indeed on a pan-territorial basis. But my view on tariffs is as follows. Okay, they have a form and a function in certain instances. But if we're talking about global trade, and is our conversation here, tariffs are going to be prohibitive. They're going to be prohibitive in terms of innovation. They're going to be prohibitive in terms of growth, both growth in terms of at an enterprise level and at respective economy level as well. Because ultimately, if we handicap trade and innovation through tariffs, there will be a consequence, and that consequence will be felt, not just in the Irish economy, it'll be felt in all economies. And ultimately, I do believe that, as every company looks to internationalize, because large companies, every company has to look to global markets. Very few companies stay isolated within their own home market. They actually look to global markets. And having, I suppose, common law, having agreements that are global in terms of nature from a trade perspective is so critically important. So my hope would be is that we will move to a position, and I think we will also see narrative in terms of, from a European Commission perspective, that the European Commission is very quickly going to, I suppose, embrace conversations and collaboration on international and global trade. And I think that is the path forward, not just for Ireland, but for Europe, and indeed for North America and Asia Pac.
Yeah, the impression that I'm getting from that answer is that what you appear to be saying, without my putting words in your mouth as such, is that look, there are too many dangers, not just for those on the receiving end of the tariffs, but also for those who are imposing the tariffs, and maybe the reality could actually row back the rhetoric.
Well, my sense is supply chains are highly integrated globally. And if you're going to disrupt supply chains, like we've already seen, let's call it, how disruptive supply chain and what that does to inflation, what that does to delivery across the world. And, that was, through the COVID pandemic. I can't see how we could, how any nation or indeed bloc would go on if you want to call it a predetermined path to actually disrupt supply chains, because you will end up with similar scenarios in terms of impact, in terms of inflationary impacts, supply impacts, and ultimately, that will lead to other challenges in respective economies. So my sense would be is that, that when there's time to consider this, that I would hope that a balance will be struck between, if you want to call it, areas that you want to build maybe a competitive advantage and maybe protect some areas of business, versus open trade and allowing open trade and innovation to prosper, because we all see the benefits from innovation and open trade.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, a lot of things are said during election campaigns, and quite a few things tend to be quietly put on the back burner and just forgotten about completely once the reality of governing actually kicks in. But look, I mean, we've covered quite a bit of ground, but what I want to do is to look at individual themes as well, because, and you alluded to this in some of your earlier answers, and this was talking about infrastructure. It's a hot button political issue for many governments, not just over here in the United Kingdom, but also for Ireland. Now, what's interesting, again, the overlap between the UK and the Irish economy, is that we've seen growing demands, for example, on housing, good transport services, and also energy. And my question to you is how does the IDA Ireland actually work with the government to make sure that infrastructure projects align with the needs of incoming multinational companies? Because you're not just building these projects to serve the existing population, but they have to be an advertisement in themselves to make it to make it worthwhile from the point of view of a multinational to come in and not just stay for a couple of years, but hopefully to embed permanent roots.
Absolutely. And I think that's the very core of what we in IDA have been doing for the last 75 years. And as I mentioned, we have a cohort of 1,800 client companies. But we have a large number of companies who are 20, 30, 40, 50 years plus in Ireland and in the Irish economy. So this, if you want to call it, narrative that sometimes brought forward, that FDI is very transient. There are elements of FDI that can be transient, but there are elements of FDI that are very sticky and very engaged, and we see that here in Ireland. And how does that happen? And to your question in terms of infrastructure, it's making sure that as a state agency, and we report directly into government and into the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So we have a very direct line into the centre and core of our government system here in Ireland. And as a means of that, we actually can provide that insight and foresight as to what are not just the current needs of industry, but more importantly, the future needs of industry. And those future needs will extend across infrastructure. So, for example, we in Ireland have embedded and embraced I suppose, a pre-planning and we have developed sites and solutions for clients in the technology and in the life sciences area, where we as IDA have led that, and we've done that over multiple decades at this stage, and we continue to do that. So we have a role to play in terms of government, in terms of, if you want to call it, policy and planning in terms of infrastructure, physical delivery of infrastructure at an enterprise level, which supports, I suppose, broader economic and social infrastructure at a broader level within the economy as well. So we play our part, not just at a policy level, but also in a delivery model level as well, from an IDA perspective. And that's so critically important, because having that certainty, again, if I go back for investors, investors look to locations where they have certainty and clarity, and then they look for delivery. And that's what's so critically important for Ireland, and indeed for IDA, is that we're that path to provide that certainty and clarity and delivery in areas. Of course, to speak of some of the areas you mentioned, in terms of housing, we don't have a responsibility in housing. That's at central government, but we certainly feed into policies. We feed into, the let's call it the new technologies that can be used in terms of delivery of housing infrastructure. So we support and enable government to deliver on their ambitions as well for the broader economy.
But are you happy with the pace of infrastructure development? Because governments talk about infrastructure, but it's very difficult to achieve, sometimes within the timescales that people have in mind, because you have to go through planning regulation, and there's also the danger of schemes overrunning and becoming very expensive, and then it forces a change in the approach, the decision making. Do we stick with this anymore? Has it run out of value because it's just got too expensive, and that in itself could actually cause a political scandal? So are you happy with the pace of development? What should be a reasonable development framework?
Yeah, so I think in the context of delivering infrastructure is always multiple, it's multiple year, and actually can be maybe multiple generational, depending on the scale of infrastructure, and that is a fact. And from an Ireland perspective, we have come out of a period, where while we have a strong economy, and we have a growing economy, but we also are realistic, and we've recognized, and government has recognized this, and I think I have spoken on this, is that our infrastructure hasn't kept at the same level of pace of development as our growth. And we're seeing that in some areas, and in particular, and we mentioned about housing, but we share that challenge, as we do with many other global economies, and growing economies have similar challenges. And that's not to I suppose, downplay the challenge, but it's just a reality. When you have growth, you get strains on infrastructure. And in Ireland, the good thing is that we have recognized where our gaps are, and they are in housing, in energy, and in water. We have, more importantly, then responded in terms of having a strategy and response for housing, for energy, and for water services, and we're now implementing those responses. So if I give you, for example, we have a housing for all strategy in Ireland, and we're now actively delivering, 30 to 35,000 houses a year. We are one of the, I think it's on one of the highest levels of housing delivery in Europe is now happening in Ireland. But we have to continue that pace, because we have to catch up, and then we have to get in front and stay ahead.
But do you feel that you're closing the gap?
Well, we're starting to close the gap. I think we're built momentum. We're now up to 30,000 plus, as I mentioned, and we have to continue that momentum. There might be some argument or some debate over, what is the ultimate number. And to be honest, I think it's more important that we actually get momentum and capacity within our system, and that's now what we're doing, and that we deliver good quality, mixed-use developments and homes for a variety of uses and purpose, and that's where we're getting to. And the same in terms of energy. We are now investing very heavily in offshore renewables, bringing those offshore renewables on site, on land, sorry. And we're starting to, we are at the phase now of actually developing that. And how we've enabled that, and government has recognized this, is that we have just, in recent weeks, our Dáil, our government, has just endorsed and supported the largest bill, second largest bill in the history of the state, in terms of refreshing our planning legislation and planning laws. And that is to bring another level of clarity and certainty and speed into large projects and into investment projects. So as we see that new Planning Act coming into force from next year on, we will start to see the benefits of bringing that certainty and clarity, especially in terms of judicial review, in terms of legislative timeframes for decisions, which are all critically important to make sure that the milestones that are important for delivery are achieved.
Because I guess that there is that pressure to meet the infrastructure development targets, because you are trying to bridge the gap. But what you don't want to do is to see companies actually say, well, we'd love to invest in Ireland, but things are a bit too slow on the development front. So in other words, you don't want people to be deterred from coming into the country because the projects, the infrastructure development projects, are not perhaps moving along as quickly as they would prefer. That's an incredible pressure point, isn't it?
It is a pressure point. You rightly identified that. But companies, I think, as well, in my experience, when investors look or companies look to invest, if you have a clear plan and you have a delivery, and Ireland has shown its capability to deliver, they have a trust in that, and they're able to align themselves. Because remember, companies themselves also have to go through planning, they have to go through procurement, they also have to construct and then operate. So there's timeframes associated with every aspect. The key is to ensure you have alignment in those timeframes and that you deliver and implement in those timeframes. And Ireland, thankfully, is a proven location for delivery and a trusted partner in terms of that delivery as well. And that's what we need to continue to strive to be as we continue to grow our economy, both from an enterprise perspective and a population perspective.
And look, so much innovation is happening in the business landscape. It's very welcome, of course, but at the same time, with innovation come issues of regulation. And I guess my point to you, and I'm asking this question within the context of the EU and US Chips Act, and of course the recent AI Act from the European Union, do you fear that over-regulation could potentially be disadvantageous, not just to Ireland, but also the EU? It's one of those questions which will always crop up. How much regulation is, well, what is sufficient regulation? Isn't there the danger of over-regulating and basically deterring the money, keeping it away?
Yeah, and I think there is a role for regulation, and we have to acknowledge that. The key is to get the balance right. So we need to be regulation for regulation purpose. For the sake of regulation is not required. But what is required from a regulation is to protect risk, real risk, and to ensure that the general population is protected is critically important, no matter what area you look across regulation. So regulation has its role, but we have to get that balance right. And in some cases, I think in Europe, we possibly have leaned too far towards regulation and potentially has stifled innovation, or has maybe reduced the flow of finance for, especially maybe for startup and early stage companies. And again, I think it's about striking that balance. The other part of your question was in terms of incentives and the Chips Act, and the European Chips Act and the US Chips Act and IPCES. And again, incentivification has really changed as well in the last number of years, driven by the Chips Act, as well. So again, we in Ireland will be advocating for, there is a role for incentivification, but again, that shouldn't be overly utilized. It shouldn't be such that it distorts markets or distorts the offering from a particular country over A country over B country. I think there still needs to be balance, both from a regulatory perspective and an incentive perspective. And Ireland are clearly advocating for that within our partners in Europe as well.
But why do you think that Europe has actually got the regulatory balance wrong?
And why it's got it, I'm not sure it's got it completely wrong, because if we think about, in some areas Europe has led out in regulation. So if we think of on the AI Act, for example, and AI regulation, there is no doubt to my mind that we need regulation, and I think Europe is possibly getting that balance right, because it's actually tiering it in terms of high level to low level, and the regulation is being adopted based on the level of severity as well. I think that's the right model. I think blanket regulation needs to assess risk and impact. And I think regulation should match the risk and impact, which is what's happening. And the same, like Ireland let out in GDPR, and I think it was the right thing because again, it protected the user. So regulation has its place. It just needs to be targeted at the right areas and the right areas of risk. And for example, where Europe probably needs, and this has been identified, the Letty report as well, is that Europe needs to ensure that that you actually can balance that risk and regulation. And when I speak about in startups or in early stage companies, and in particular in terms of attracting VC, you need to make sure that that regulatory focus is also balanced with, if you want to call it, a risk and reward focus. And as I mentioned, Letty has identified that as one area within his report.
And whenever we talk about multinational corporations actually working in Ireland, we shouldn't forget as well that the academic and research institutions are also important within that nexus. So how does your organisation actually encourage collaboration between these parties?
Yeah, so in our portfolio, in the IDA and the foreign direct investment portfolio, we're very fortunate that we have a strong cohort of companies that are involved at the cutting edge of innovation, that are doing strong levels of R&D here in Ireland, and are obviously engaging with our academic centres, both from a research perspective and a skills perspective. So we're very fortunate. In Ireland, from an IDA perspective, we've actually taken the lead in some areas. So, for example, we have invested in research institutions ourselves, such as the National Institute for Bioprocessing Research and Training, which supports the biologics industry and the pharmaceutical industry. And this is a centre that we established over a decade ago, and which is now recognised globally as one of the leading centres in terms of research for manufacturability and for training and upskilling for new modalities as well. And it's a model that we have used very well in Ireland, where we actually ensure that our centres and our academic centres are aligned to industrial need. And that's where I think the strength of IDA and of our ecosystem really comes to the fore, is that we can link the future needs of our clients and of industry with the work programs within our academic and research centres, and marry the two together so that we get a collective benefit, both from if you want to call it an academic perspective, an innovation and research perspective, and indeed a commercial impact as well, because you are seeing it being commercialised through Irish enterprises, both foreign direct and indeed Indigenous enterprises.
Okay, I mean, it's a great story that you're telling me, and there's incredible room for optimism, etc. So thank you for that. But again, just to play the devil's advocate here, we've got all this money which is coming in, we've got all the multinationals which are working with various research institutes, etc., and the results speak for themselves. But there is a danger that the benefits do not spread to the whole country. So in other words, how can you make sure that it isn't just confined to the major urban centres? Because you don't want to have a division similar to what we have in the United Kingdom between the north and the south, where yes, the money is coming in, the companies, etc., but the perception is that the benefits are just concentrated in one part of the country at the expense of the other, because that breeds resentment.
It's an excellent question and observation, and you're correct. And in Ireland, and in IDA in particular, we have been very focused and indeed deliberate in ensuring balanced regional development. And what does that look like? What it looks like is that we have a target to deliver a number of investments every year and through our 5-year strategy delivery. 50% of those investments are publicly committed outside of the Dublin region. And of course, Dublin in an Ireland context being our major city and major international city. So we have publicly focused on making sure balanced regional development is a core of our organisation, and indeed actually is supported within government policy. And we have actively delivered on that. So as we sit today, we are achieving over 50% of our investments outside of Dublin, number one. And that's across all sectors. So we have built incredible medical device cluster on the west of Ireland. We have a pharmaceutical cluster in the south and the midwest of Ireland. We have a financial services cluster in Dublin, but also supported across the entirety of Ireland. And we've seen that benefit move if you want to call it, in terms of economic prosperity and indeed opportunity on an all-Ireland basis. And when I mentioned the 300,000 people that's employed in FDI companies, as I say, 50% of our investments are outside of Ireland, but also over 50% of our employment is outside of Ireland. So we have actively and proactively promoted balanced regional development. And that's something that it's inherent in our DNA, in IDA, and something that we are going to continuously strive to improve, because we have to make sure we have counterbalances in Ireland from the East Coast to the West Coast, and building those, if you want to call it, cities and clusters of excellence along the Western seaboard is a key priority for us.
But you've also got to strike the balance between, on the one hand, bringing in foreign multinationals and promoting growth amongst Indigenous Irish companies. In other words, you don't want Indigenous Irish companies to feel they're somehow being kicked to the back of the queue because they're not as sexy as Apple or whoever else chooses to come in. So how do you strike that particular balance? Because that, I would imagine, is pretty tough.
Yeah, and it is, but again, it goes back to that piece of balance, and I think it also goes back to an understanding of the benefit of enterprise as a whole, and whether it's Indigenous or whether it's foreign direct investment. I think we're fortunate in Ireland, very fortunate, I think, in Ireland, that we have, I think, a society that values enterprise as number one, and to see the value of enterprise both from an FDI perspective and indeed a local Indigenous perspective. They also firsthand experience how the interlink and interconnection of FDI and Indigenous companies have been established and are supporting and are, I think, are actually dovetailing and working together. So there are many Indigenous companies, for example, who have grown on the back of the partnership and introductions with foreign direct investments through their supply chain. We have, to give you an example, the data center industry has been a real strength and growth area in Ireland over the last decade and more. And in fact, it is over the world has continued to grow. One of the largest cohorts of companies that has grown, Indigenous companies, are those in the digital economy and data center world, where we've seen companies have grown their expertise and are not just supporting Irish data center construction, maintenance, and delivery. They're also supporting across the globe. So that's an example of how we've successfully integrated our FDI supply chain with our Indigenous enterprise base, and has involved, if you want to call it, a reciprocal growth, both from an FDI perspective and an Indigenous perspective.
So there's integration between the two, effectively.
It is. And of course, maybe just to go back, and other, I suppose, real advantage you get from that integration is it also undoubtedly makes sure that your regional balance becomes deeper and more ingrained as well. So there's multiple benefits to this, that go beyond, let's just call it, economics. There's societal benefits, there's geographical benefits to ensuring we have that as well.
But is your organisation also under pressure to encourage green and sustainable investments? Because, 20, 30 years ago, that seemed very, very much like a fringe interest. But now, of course, it's very much to the forefront. It's influencing these green issues. It's influencing the behaviour of boardrooms, organisations to prove their green credentials at a time when governments and companies are under pressure to reduce their carbon footprints.
And you're absolutely correct in that, because there's two areas to think about that companies are focused on. They're focused on sustainable and green, and they're focused on digitalization. So those twin areas of sustainable and green and digitalization are at the very core of every conversation we have with our existing cohort of companies, and indeed as we look to attract new companies who are going to sustain and grow the economy, both in terms of a digital perspective or a green or an energy perspective. And to give some examples of that, we are seeing in the last 3 to 4 years in particular, an increased level of capital being invested by our client companies in sustainable solutions, in decarbonisation. And of course, in Ireland, we have made legally binding commitments in terms of reduction of our CO2 by 2040, a 35% reduction. And as we sit here today, this afternoon, we are already almost 40% of our journey on helping companies to decarbonise against our 2030 target. So we're making good progress at this juncture. And that's coming through capital investments that companies are making on alternative energy sources, on, I suppose, improving their processes, implementing technologies such as heat pumps and so forth. So you're actually seeing the physical transition happening within production plants and facilities within Ireland to remove and reduce their carbon footprint.
Mm. But this is all happening at a time when the foreign direct investment stage is looking very, very crowded. There are so many players. And my question to you is, how can you actually maintain and indeed increase your competitive edge when you're up against lower cost emerging markets who might actually be able to offer perhaps what's seen as a bit more because they're starting from a lower base?
So as I mentioned, the competitiveness for FDI has never been as intense. And in Ireland, we're I suppose we have a 75-year history of, and we have come through that evolution as well from an FDI perspective of being a lower cost location or a low cost location to now an evolution where we are a high value, innovative, embedded economy where we actually bring value, and companies actually can build, global businesses and support the global business through Ireland. And where we compete in that high value innovation space. And it's so critically important. And as I mentioned earlier, when you look at the one area that indicates, I think, that shift in the dynamics of the Irish economy and indeed of the delivery and capability within Ireland is the R&D expenditure across our cohort of companies over the last decade. That R&D expenditure is now in excess of 5 billion euros on an annual basis. That's, as I mentioned, a 500% increase in a decade. So we have seen a marked increase in terms of Ireland, where Ireland brings its value, and how Ireland brings that value into global supply chains, how Ireland brings that value to contribute to, if you want to call it, the ambitions of the respective organizations and companies. And that's based on having the right talent, making sure we have enabling infrastructure, and keeping our policies, our wider industrial policies, supportive for innovation and growth.
Let's project into the future. If you and I are having a conversation in 5 years' time, what vision will you be describing to me for IDA Ireland, and how does that fit into Ireland's role in the evolving global economy? Ireland has a fantastic diplomatic reputation, and it's obviously reflected with the economy. But in 5 years' time, what type of economy will we be talking about? And what about the IDA? How central would its role have been in fulfilling that vision?
Yeah, so in 5 years, the vision for IDA, and I think IDA and the Irish economy are so intrinsically linked. So I think the vision for IDA is a vision for the Irish economy from an enterprise perspective. The vision is that we will have an economy that's underpinned by sustainable, reliable, and cost-effective energy, and we deliver that through offshore wind. We'll have an economy which has deepened its R&D and innovation. We have an economy which is at the front end of new products and services, whether you're in high value life sciences or technology. And thirdly, fourthly, an economy that has the skills that's necessary to succeed in a digital age. And that's going to be the key in terms of the next 5 years. It's going to be sustainable, it's going to be digital, and we're going to have to ensure that our economy delivers the infrastructure to enable that to happen.
A really important political stability, obviously, with the 2024 Irish general election and how that is perceived by international investors. I would imagine that as part of your strategizing, you have to get into the headspace of international investors. What are you seeing through their prism about that general election and about Ireland, where it is now and its future against this volatile backdrop politically, and also the competition that is happening on that FDI stage?
Well, I've actually had in the last month alone, I've met with a number of international leaders, and I could quite honestly say that each of those conversations points to having stability, and the critical importance of stability of government and stability of policy is central in their minds and in their thoughts. And when they think of Ireland, they actually think that, and they believe and they know that Ireland means that stability and that certainty. So in the context of conversations that I'm having, and you can never take anything for granted, but in Ireland, we do know that we have absolute political alignment about the necessity of economic performance, of economic growth, and indeed of industrial policies that support that. And I think that has, our success thus far has been because we've had that connectivity and connection at an entire political spectrum. And that's going to continue and will continue. And I think leaders and investors that know Ireland know that that's the case. So we're very fortunate to be in that position. And I do believe that we will continue to be that, as about that stable location in a global world where there is a lot of turmoil, where there is elements of change and maybe transformation happening. And in Ireland, we too will have to transform, but we'll transform from a point of stability. We'll transform, make sure we're going to have certainty. And maybe the last thing I'd say in this is that we will also ensure that we do that in a collaborative manner. So companies and I suppose investors are aware of the trajectory that Ireland will go on over the next decade.
And following on from what you've just said, Ireland's Minister for Finance recently announced the first transfer into what has been described as the Future Ireland Fund. So my question to you is, do you see this as being helpful to both your organisation and also enterprise development in the country?
Without a shadow of a doubt, yes, because I think it's so critically important to have a sovereign fund such as we have. Actually, we have two. One is focused on infrastructure, which we've spoken about, the necessity to ensure that that as a state that we continue to invest consistently in infrastructure, and having these funds in place gives the state the ability, irrespective of if there comes choppy waters in the times ahead, but we have the financial resource to continue to invest through that without putting burden, I think, back on the greater public or indeed on the budget of the day at the time. And the second fund we have is actually in the area of sustainable change. And I think those two areas are going to be so critically important. And in Ireland, it's our intention to be able to invest in both infrastructure and sustainable transition for the next generations to come. And the two funds allow us that flexibility to do that.
Okay, a positive note on which to end this conversation. But Michael Lohan, CEO of IDA Ireland, thank you so much for joining me on the European Magazine webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.